Imagine a man so blinded by power that he burned his clothes every day, terrified of poisons, while his people starved to build a palace that not even a king would dare dream of. What you are about to hear is not a fictional story, but the harsh reality of Nicolae Ceausescu, the dictator who transformed Romania into a shadow of his own image. Today we'll explore how a delusion of omnipotence shaped an entire nation, from an obsession with security to colossal architectural fantasies, to a denouement so swift and brutal it still shocks our consciences. Prepare to delve into the dark heart of history. Nicolae Ceausescu, a name that for many evokes oppression as poverty and a disturbing megalomania. For over 2 decades, from 1965 to 1989, this man held Romania under the iron fist of a regime that became the very epitome of delusions of omnipotence. His leadership was not just unbridled autocracy, it was an orchestra of brutal repression, a personality cult taken to its extreme, and a megalomania so profound that it forever changed the face of a nation. His legacy is a warning, a long and ominous shadow of devastation for the people he was meant to lead. At first, Ceausescu was viewed with some hope. He distanced himself from Soviet influence more openly than other Eastern Bloc leaders, earning him some initial, if fleeting, international sympathy. But this apparent independence was soon supplanted by increasingly suffocating internal control. He created a secret police force, the Securitate, which became proverbial for its brutality and pervasive network of informants. Every conversation was whispered, every opinion posed a deadly risk. The entire country became an open air prison where fear was the only currency. But there is one symbol, more than any other, that embodies this mad ambition and this contempt for the lives of its citizens. The People's Palace, or as it is known today, the Palace of the Parliament in Bucharest. It was the culmination of his obsession with power and prestige, a monument to his greatness that was to surpass anything he had ever built before. It wasn't just a building, it was a desperate cry from a man who wanted to be eternal, an affirmation of his mastery over time and history. Imagine a colossal structure, made almost entirely of white marble, so gigantic that it was among the largest in the world. With over 1,100 rooms, a surface area of 365,000 square meters, and a volume that even exceeds that of the Great Pyramid of Cheops, it is an architectural monster that puts any other European construction to shame. For its construction, entire parts of Bucharest's historic center were razed to the ground, with centuries old churches, hospitals, and entire residential neighborhoods demolished. Thousands of people were evicted from their homes with little notice, their lives uprooted to make way for this marble and concrete madness. The cost unimaginable, billions of dollars, a sum that drained already scarce national resources. While the People's Palace stood majestically, glittering under the Bucharest sun, the Romanian people suffered from hunger and scarcity. There was no heating in homes in winter, electricity was rationed to a few hours a day, food was limited to minimal quantities, and gasoline was almost impossible to find. People stood in endless lines for a piece of bread, for a little milk, for anything that could help them survive. Living conditions were so extreme that malnutrition and disease were the order of the day. It was a stark, almost surreal contrast, a nation dying of cold and hunger, while its leaders spent fortunes on marble, crystal chandeliers, and hand woven carpets for a palace that would never be fully utilized. Ceausescu's attitude was one of utter contempt for the conditions of his citizens, a willful blindness fueled by his belief that he was a genius acting for the supreme good of Romanian socialism. He and his wife Elena, however, lived in unbridled luxury, surrounded by exquisite foods, tailor made clothes, and world travel, all while their people were in darkness and starving. This ostentation only further fueled his oversized ego, convincing him more and more of his infallibility and his divine mission. But behind the facade of grandeur and power, Nicolae Ceausescu was a man consumed by paranoia. His obsession with security was palpable and pervasive, almost comical in its absurdity, had it not been so tragic in its consequences. He lived in constant fear of plots, betrayals, and attacks. Every shadow, every whisper, every look seemed a sign of threat. His most specific and bizarre fear? Chemical plots. Ceausescu was convinced that someone could poison him or contaminate him through his clothes. This led him to a surreal practice. He burned his clothes after every single use. He didn't wash them, he didn't disinfect them, he simply destroyed them. Imagine the expense and logistics involved in maintaining such a vast, constantly updated wardrobe just to satisfy this bizarre fear of hers. That wasn't the only precaution. Every meal had to be tasted by an official taster before he and Elena could touch it. Every room they stayed in had to be thoroughly inspected and disinfected. He never used the same objects twice for fear of being exposed to some harmful substance. His bathrooms were often tiled with special ceramics, and he himself underwent frequent medical checkups by a team of trusted doctors. His circle of protection was immense, made up of loyal bodyguards and thousands of Securitate agents who constantly monitored him, not only from outsiders but also from anyone who might approach. He created a veritable cordon sanitaire around himself, cutting himself off from the reality of his own country. This climate of suspicion and terror spread to all levels of society. No one was safe, no one could trust anyone. Wiretaps were everywhere, complaints were commonplace, and the mere expression of doubt could cost one's freedom or life. But behind this man, or perhaps next to him, there was another equally fearsome and influential figure, his wife, Elena Ceausescu. Often described as ruthless, ambitious, and diabolical, Helena wielded crucial influence over her husband and national policy. She was no mere consort, she was a co-dictator, an eminence grise who shared Nikolai's thirst for power and often surpassed him in cruelty. Despite having an extremely limited education and by many accounts poor intellectual ability, Elena proclaimed herself a world-renowned scientist in accumulating bogus academic titles and assuming positions of power based on dubious expertise. She became vice president of the State Council, head of the Academy of Sciences, and head of many other key institutions, in turn appointing people loyal to her and her husband, often ignoring any criteria of real competence. It was Elena who pushed Nikolai towards the most extreme policies, especially the economic ones that led to disastrous austerity and the forced export of agricultural and industrial products to repay the foreign debt, leaving the Romanian people to starve. Her vanity was matched by her cruelty. She demanded to be called Mother of the Nation and controlled every aspect of cultural and scientific life. His contribution to the general deterioration of the country was immense, further cementing the atmosphere of fear and arbitrariness. Together, Nikolai and Elena formed a symbiotic pair of tyrants, reinforcing each other in their delusions and ruthlessness, until their rule became an unbreathable pall over all of Romania. But even the most rock-solid regime is destined to collapse when the weight of suppression becomes unbearable. December 1989 was a month of unrest throughout Eastern Europe. The Berlin Wall had fallen, other communist regimes were imploding, but Ceausescu seemed to live in a parallel universe, unaware of the history that was unfolding around him. Then came Timișoara, a city in southwestern Romania which became the spark. Protests began on December 16th against the repression of a Hungarian pastor, Laszlo Tokes. The demonstration spread rapidly, and security forces, including the Securitate, responded with unprecedented brutality, opening fire on crowds and causing hundreds of deaths. Ceausescu, in an act of incredible political short-sightedness, decided to call a mass demonstration in Bucharest on December 21st, hoping to replicate his usual rallies of spontaneous support for the regime. But this time something went wrong. The crowd, initially gathered by force, began to whistle and shout at the dictator. The images of Ceausescu on the balcony, visibly confused and fearful as his speech was interrupted, became iconic. It was a turning point. People poured into the streets, and what had begun as an attempt to reassert power turned into a full-scale popular uprising. The army, initially loyal, was subjected to immense pressure. Many soldiers were tired of the regime and sympathized with the population. Within days, military units began deserting and joining the protesters rebelling against the Securitate. The fighting was fierce, with the Security desperately trying to defend the regime, but it was too late. The dam had broken. Ceausescu and Elena attempted a desperate escape by helicopter from the roof of the Central Committee on December 22nd, just as the mob stormed the building. But their escape was short-lived. After a series of failed attempts to find refuge, they were tracked down and arrested near the city of Târgoviște. Their delusions of omnipotence had reached their climax. And then, Christmas 1989. A day that should have brought peace became the stage for one of the most brutal and swift epilogues in modern history. Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu were subjected to a summary trial, a real farce of a trial, which took place on December 25th in a barracks in Târgoviște. They were not given access to a lawyer of their choosing, the charges were read hastily, and they were given no opportunity to properly defend themselves. They were accused of genocide, subversion of the state, destruction of the national economy, and other crimes. Their responses, full of denial and arrogance, only sealed their fate. The verdict was delivered within minutes, guilty. The sentence, death. The execution took place immediately afterwards in the barracks courtyard before the eyes of a platoon of soldiers. The cameras were there, ready to capture every moment. The raw and shocking image of the dictator and his wife being executed, broadcast live on television around the world, became the symbol of a sudden and dramatic end. The blood of the tyrants shed on Christmas Day represented for many Romanians not only an act of revenge but a cathartic liberation from years of terror and oppression. Nicolae Ceausescu's delusions of omnipotence had dissolved not in a long decline but in a single violent flash. His story is a powerful warning about what can happen when power is unchecked, when reality is distorted at will, and when the suffering of the people becomes invisible to the eyes of those in power. Romania has begun a new, troubled journey towards freedom, finally freeing itself from the shadow of a man who had tried to make himself God. If this story has moved you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories that reveal the darkest aspects of history.